Hi, this is Amey Mashelkar. I'm the head of JioGenNext, which is a corporate startup accelerator program of Reliance Industries. And the topic of this masterclass is co-founders, essential framework for a healthy co-founding team. So I'm going to broadly cover the following topics. The first one is who are co-founders? The second one is what are the values that one should look for in your co-founders? The third one is how do you pen down the arrangement between yourself and your co-founders before you start your startup? The fourth one is how do you pilot or do a proof of concept of your relationship with your co-founders before you go all in? The fifth one is what are some of the common conflicts that arise during the course of building your startup? The sixth one is communication and why it's super important. And the last one is parting ways, if at all it comes to that situation. So just starting off with the first topic, who are co-founders? Co-founders could be your friends whom you've known for a very long time. It could be your family or members of your community. In India, we see a lot of startups being formed by members of the same community. They could be your ex-colleagues at your previous workplace or even batchmates in college or even from your school days. And the reason why I'm saying that these three could be broadly the categories is because a previous relationship or a familiarity of that person or the co-founder is always advantageous because you know the strengths and weaknesses of that person, how that person works, what are the work ethics, etc. Just to get into the value system, the first thing that every co-founder needs to have is an aptitude for the business that they're getting into. You have to have sufficient understanding of that domain. You have to be able to analyze, synthesize information about your market, about your industry, about your customer. And you need to have a basic level of intelligence to build your startup. Therefore, aptitude is very, very important to look for in your co-founder. The second one is ability. It's not just important to have the aptitude for that domain in which you want to build your startup, but the co-founder also needs to have the ability to execute the ideas that you all have on the table. Because ultimately, an idea is just an idea. They are a dime a dozen. What differentiates an average startup from a successful startup is the ability to execute really well on the idea. And the third one, which is extremely important, and I would say that this is the most important value that you need to look for in a co-founder, is the right attitude. Is the co-founder humble? Is the co-founder willing to think long term? Is the co-founder collaborative, willing to work with others? Because in the course of building your startup, you might work with a lot of different people from the ecosystem, and therefore attitude will matter a lot. And we see a lot of startups failing in the industry because founders didn't have the right attitude. And I'll get into this a little more later on. And therefore, the equation is aptitude into ability into attitude. Even if one of them is zero, the result is zero. So for example, you might have the best aptitude for that business. You might have the ability to execute that startup really well. But if you don't have the right attitude to build your startup and it is zero, the result is zero. Therefore, it's extremely important to have all these three attributes in place. It's not necessary that all of the co-founders need to have all of these three attributes. One of them could be more on the aptitude side. The other one could have the ability to execute and manage the operations. One could be the person who kind of brings everybody together, is humble, etc. And between y'all, all three of y'all or all four of y'all, or whatever the number is of co-founders, you all should be able to cover all these different attributes well. But what is essential is that the CEO needs to have all three attributes. A CEO needs to demonstrate that early on. The CEO needs to have a deep understanding of the business, the ability to execute well, and the attitude to take everybody along. And you should ideally appoint the person who has all these three attributes as your CEO. So once you've kind of identified who your potential co-founders are going to be for your startup, it's extremely important to have an arrangement. And this is a very different suggestion that I'm making out here. Not a lot of founders actually get down and write down the relationship. But it's extremely important that you do this before you get started so that there is an understanding between all the founders as to how you're going to build your startup, right? So a couple of points around the arrangement that you should write down. First of all, it's important to write it down and not just have it in your mind. The first thing that you need to have is a common understanding of the goals and the business. If one person is, looking in the direction of west, the other one is looking eastward, there is no common understanding of how you're going to do things, it's going to be very difficult going forward. And this is the best time before you get started to have this clarity penned down on paper. The next thing is responsibilities, because obviously you don't want to get into a startup with a co-founder before understanding who's going to do what, right? It's too soon to look at accountability, but it's very important to look at responsibility, right? Because you have to be responsible towards the task that you've been given or that you own up in building your startup. The next one, which I've seen a lot of founders struggling at, is who will decide what. In a lot of cases, there will be decisions that will be made by individuals. So, for example, a CEO can make the overall decision for the betterment of the company, but a CTO, for example, can take a decision that's in the best interest of the technology roadmap, which a CEO may or may not understand. So the CTO is well placed to take that decision. In certain cases, the CTO is also the CEO, and therefore that complication is not there. But there have to be very clear areas that you define where all of y'all will come together and decide jointly, so as to avoid a lot of conflict going forward. It's extremely important to know who the CEO is. I've seen a lot of startups where founders, there is a co-CEO, and so we don't know who's actually calling the shots, who's taking decisions. Ultimately, there has to be just one CEO, and the others could be COO, CMO, CTO, etc. But CEO is the person that is the most important person in the organization, and co-founders need to come to that arrangement and decide who the CEO is going to be. You need to also write down what are the major milestones in your journey that you want to accomplish. It could be building your initial product, it could be getting your first customer, it could be a major fundraising milestone that you're attempting to achieve. But just broad major milestones, maybe 2 or 3 of them, not many of them, in the initial stages will do. And then you can, of course, iterate those milestones, because even milestones will change in terms of timelines and the nature of the milestone itself. But it's extremely important to write it down as to how you see the startup progressing from day zero. This is something that a lot of founders struggle with later on, and therefore it's extremely important to have all this clarified right in the beginning as to who will have how much shareholding in the company. Will the CEO have more? Will the CTO have less? Will the CTO have more? Will the CEO have less? It's always important that one of the shareholders has a little more than the others, because then that person is the one who's responsible. And this, in most of the cases, has to be the CEO, right? And it doesn't need to be significantly more. It could just be 1 share more, or half a percentage more. But there has to be one who's a little more senior than the others, so that when it comes to decision making, there is one person who is ultimately responsible for taking decisions for the company. and the rest of them then have to go with that decision. The other thing that's important to understand is compensation. In the early stages of a startup, obviously founders cannot pay themselves until they raise capital or until they achieve some kind of unit economics and are able to meet the operational expenses further of the company. And therefore, you should have a clear understanding of the compensation, not necessarily the number that you want to agree on, but that, hey, look, this is how we are going to get compensated. The CEO is going to get, typically compensated like this. This is going to be compensation for the co-founders. This is the ESOP, employee stock options, that we will set aside for so and so people in the organization. So this aspect is extremely important to write down when you're starting out. You need to also come to an arrangement on how you will resolve conflicts, because you will have a lot of conflicts going on as you start building your startup. Sometimes these conflicts are uncontrollable. So while you might not be able to foresee every conflict that might arise, it's important to know how you will resolve them, right? So you should have some broad philosophy or values that you should write down, saying that this is how we will sit down, we will communicate, we will talk transparently, and this is how we will resolve, or at least strive to resolve all the conflicts. This is proof of concept is another sort of unusual suggestion from my side. I've not seen a lot of people doing this. Typically, founders will get together, they like each other, they immediately get started, but it's extremely important to pilot the relationship. So before you incorporate and you set up the shareholding, etc., you need to work on a small micro project together, right? It could be something small as, hey, look, let's come together and write down the arrangement, or let's write down a business plan, right? And then you'll be able to see a lot of unexpected things when you start working together, especially if you've not worked together in the past directly with each other, and if it's a new relationship, you'll start discovering a lot of things. So the idea is not to panic if you see a lot of disagreements, but what you need to figure out is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the other person, right? Each person should be able to objectively and independently analyze the strengths and weaknesses of the other person. And at this stage, it is only to first identify them and not to act upon them. So you shouldn't go into a mode of actually pointing it out, but just to understand, how the other person actually is. And you should be aware of all the adjustments that would be needed going forward. So for example, if a person has a certain weakness that you are not very comfortable with, right? It could be as simple as maybe that person speaks too loudly and you're not comfortable with that. So in your mind, if you think that the strengths overweigh the weaknesses of that person, then you need to kind of make some mental adjustments within yourself, saying that, hey, look, ultimately we have to achieve this common goal. And so therefore I will have to adjust to this person as opposed to the other way around. So therefore, each co-founder has to have the ability to adjust to the other founder. You should obviously proceed only with full conviction that you're comfortable with your co-founders. If you think that, I cannot compromise on these one or two things that, I observed about my co-founder, then it's best not to go down that road, because building a startup is a very long journey. You have to work together for a very long time. And it doesn't make sense if you're not fully convinced. However, you need to be able to differentiate between major weaknesses and minor weaknesses that you can adjust to, right? If it's going to be in direct conflict with some of your core values, then perhaps you need to think about it again and then figure out whether you want to still go ahead. with that co-founder. But if it's not such a big thing and you can adjust, then you can sort of go ahead with full conviction. So therefore, it's extremely important to do a proof of concept of your relationship and work on a small micro project before you dive in and start working together on your new startup. So even after having thought through all these things and finding the perfect co-founders for your startup, there will be conflicts. And so I just want to broadly kind of point out some of the conflicts that might arise. So the first one obviously is shareholding and compensation. There are a lot of conflicts around this. Something was agreed to in the original arrangement, something needs to change. Somebody is getting more, somebody is getting less. All that is going to happen. And so you should be aware that this is a conflict that's going to come and you should be able to sit down and resolve it with your co-founders. It's extremely important to know who's running the company because a lot of times, uh, you know, somebody is a CEO, but there's somebody else attending all the key meetings with investors, with customers, and taking all the major decisions of the company. And you don't want to confuse the ecosystem. You want to be very clear, first of all, within yourselves as to who's running the company, who's the CEO, and then basically project that in the proper way to the external ecosystem. There are conflicts around visibility. So, for example, sometimes one of the founders is more visible in the ecosystem than the other, or there is no visibility amongst any of the co-founders in the ecosystem, and therefore there is a quarrel over how we should increase the visibility and how it's not enough. So visibility can lead to a lot of friction within the founders, and so you should be aware of this issue. It can be very sensitive at times, and you should be able to deal with it. Excessive visibility in the early stages is also not really great because in the early stages you need to put your head down and build your startup. After you achieve certain amount of success, then obviously visibility will automatically increase. Managing stakeholders is extremely important. You will have investors, you will have customers, you will have employees, you will have other shareholders, and managing everybody becomes super important. In fact, at some point you will feel that all of you are managing all these people more than doing anything else. And so a lot of conflicts can arise from that. Who's supposed to manage what relationship? Why hasn't the CEO talked to the investor transparently about X, Y, and Z? Or who will talk to this customer and resolve this issue? Managing stakeholders becomes a very, very big point of conflict. Ethics and governance is extremely important. One sees startups actually going down the wrong road on this, in terms of misreporting of revenues, in terms of hyperinflated valuations, in terms of spending excessively, burning through cash, in terms of other wrongful doings within the company. And so therefore this issue can also give way to a lot of conflicts between founders, and this also needs to be dealt with extremely objectively. And you need to identify, like I said earlier, you need to identify major decisions that will be taken jointly. So for example, spending, building up liabilities in the company should be a joint decision. I've seen founders actually building up these liabilities, and then towards the end, before they're getting acquired, like trying to figure out how to square all the liabilities so that they can get a better deal, and then blaming each other for having built up those liabilities. All these kind of issues come up. Fundraising, again, it should be a joint decision that you should take on how much to raise, why are you raising, how much value are you going to raise it at, what are the deliverables to the investors. All of you should sign off on that. Hiring and letting go is also a very big decision that you should make jointly during the early stages of the startup. Of course, I mean, it all depends on your respective domains. So for example, if I'm a non-technical founder, I will not get into the decision making of the CTO. I will go by her judgment on who should be hired. But at the same time, when it comes to letting go of people, even if you all are not speaking jointly to people, it should be a joint decision on how you want to deal with that situation and how you want to communicate it, etc. Other major decisions are acquisitions and exit. A lot of conflict arises around that time in terms of who should get what, all of that stuff. Just to kind of, negate all the conflicts, communication becomes super important. Too less communication is also bad. Like if you've not talked to each other for like weeks together, then that's a bad sign for a startup, and also for others who are probably going to invest in you. Uh, Too much confrontation can also be uh, an issue, especially if it is like toxic level of there's too much toxicity in the kind of confrontation and communication that's happening within the company. So too less is bad. Too much confrontational communication is also bad. Too much of good communication is always welcome, obviously. So you need to have a balance of communication. Uh, you should also, over time, develop an unspoken understanding. It's extremely important that with your partners, you need to be able to study their body language, understand how they're thinking, and react accordingly. And for that, you have to spend a lot of time together. So, I don't believe in this whole thing of people being distributed across the world and never spending time with each other in the same room. I think, especially in the early stages of a startup, everybody needs to be together because there's a lot that happens outside of just formal meetings, and that develops the unspoken understanding between founders, which is going to be extremely critical for you to keep your startup together, because not everything is going to be spoken out by each person. Ultimately, you're building a startup, and you need to be objective about your goals and your vision and mission and what you want to accomplish in terms of your goals. So you have to be as objective as possible in your journey and never lose that objectivity. And objectivity is the only thing that brings everybody together on the same page, right? And pointed in the same direction. So this is a little bit about how you can use communication as a tool to resolve the conflicts that I showed on the earlier slide. Finally, I would say that unfortunately, if let's say the startup doesn't work out, one has to part ways, and a lot of startups, end up that way. Not all startups are widely successful. So one of the issues is around exits. So how do you part ways around an exit? Who will continue? Who will not continue? Do you have an arrangement and do you have an understanding? And have you communicated that understanding between the two of you as to who will do what after the exit? Let's say your company is getting acquired by XYZ, and that company requires only two of the co-founders of the three co-founders, as an example. Then have you already agreed between you all that this is going to happen and we are okay with it, and two of us will continue, this third person will have to look at something else, or if that third person actually wants to leave, then it should be okay with the other two co-founders. So around exits, you need to have a very clear understanding between you all. While building your startup, also there could be disagreements over how the future should be of the company, and it's fine. And founders actually part ways over such disagreements, as long as these are, amicable, and these are dealt in a very mature way, an objective way. Disagreements can be dealt with properly, and it's a completely, it's completely fine to kind of have that as you move forward in your startup. I would say that before you either exit or quit or just part ways amicably, don't leave anything unsaid. Don't bottle up anything. Be as objective in stating what you feel about parting ways, and make sure that you don't hold anything inside. And all these conversations can always happen in a nice way. And even in parting ways, I think one of you always has to be the bigger person. And If each one of you thinks that, I'm going to be the bigger person, nothing like it, because then you'll have an excellent outcome. But at least one person has to take that responsibility and say that, look, I'm going to understand everybody in this situation, and it's just fine. And I will be the one taking that decision. I will be the one that's going to carry forward, or I will be the one that will see an outcome for everybody. So one person has to be the bigger person. Normally, the CEO has to be the bigger person, which is why it's such a difficult job. And finally, I would say that startups are transient sometimes, and they can be temporary. God willing, all startups can be successful, but if there are startups that don't work out, it's obviously, you have to look at it as a temporary situation, building a startup. But the relationships that you build during the course of your startup have to be permanent, and that should be your focus. Because when you take everything away, what remains are the relationships that you built while building your startup. So with that, I just want to go over the summary of my talk today. The first thing is that anybody can be your co-founder, and knowing that person well is advantageous. The second thing is the right attitude in the co-founder is the most important value. Other important values are aptitude and ability. The third one is write down the arrangement you are going to have between the co-founders and pilot the relationship, test it out, work on a small project and see everybody's strengths and weaknesses. Adjust. If you can't adjust, move on. But if you decide to move into the startup, then move with full conviction. You should be aware of all the potential conflicts in your journey that could arise. It should not come to you as a surprise that, oh, this happened. This kind of a conflict happened between us. You should be aware of all the conflicts. Communication is extremely important for survival of the business. Regular communication between the founders is very important in the initial stages while the startup is getting formed. And you should always know what to do when you're parting ways. One of you has to be the bigger person, and relationships are always going to be permanent. Startups are going to be temporary. Thanks very much.